Hey, good evening, everybody. We're going to get started in just about 1 minute as everyone is coming in this evening. Hope everyone's having a great Monday. And I might say one thing I really get a kick out of is seeing all of these wonderful names in the attendee list. It's like old friends are back in the room here with us, Fred.
Good.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Bender, and welcome to the fifth and final installment to the Westdale Theater's Film Talk series and the Oscar Goes To. As you know, tonight Fred will be talking about the 1969 film Midnight Cowboy, directed by John Schlesinger. But first, a little housekeeping before we begin. As you know, I'm sure by now, during Fred's talk, if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the talk, I'll round up your thoughts and pose them to Fred. Of course, please note that if some of the questions are rather similar, I'm going to combine them, but I'll be sure to provide everybody credit to all parties that contributed. Also, before we get to the talk, if you enjoyed this series and series like it, please consider going to the westdale.ca and providing a donation. And don't forget, on Thursdays on Instagram and Facebook, we have what we call Thursday Trivia, and it helps to set up the next series, but sometimes it's just a lot of fun, and you can try and see whether or not your knowledge is at expert level, or maybe you still need to bone up on some of these movies ahead of time. Finally, please stick around until the end to hear more about an upcoming Film Talk series that will begin in just a couple of weeks on April the 12th. Fred will have more information about that in just a moment. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the board of directors of the Westdale, film producer and movie expert, Mr. Fred Fugues. Good evening, Fred.
Good evening. Thank you, Jeff. And thanks, everybody, for joining us again. I know with the beautiful weather coming, maybe this is going to be a little more challenging for people to find time, but you know, we're having fun doing it, and hopefully you're having fun as well. So as long as people keep showing up, I guess we'll keep doing it. It's interesting to reflect on this series we've just completed in the 5 films. As you know, the intention originally was just to, you know, pick some of my favorite films that, you know, maybe aren't as well known, that had won Best Pictures. But I hadn't considered at all the fact that almost all of the selections, except for the first one, Grand Hotel, also are all films that really had and talked about important social issues of the day. And that these were films that were not just entertainment, but these were films that really were, you know, where the director, the filmmakers really had something to say. They were using the media film, obviously one of the most powerful forms of expression, you know, in contemporary culture, and trying to affect an audience and trying to, you know, perhaps change and give them a new perspective. And when you think about Lost Weekend and alcoholism, and then of course, Best Years of Our Lives, and the challenges of the soldiers who were returning from the war and the trauma that they had experienced, of course, in the heat of the night, you know, and the issue of racism, which was absolutely, the issue of the 60s. And now, of course, in Midnight Cowboy. And Midnight Cowboy is a little more complex. Certainly on one hand, it's trying to deal with the theme of homosexuality. That was obviously very important both to the writer and to the director. But it's also dealing with something else, and sort of an honest portrayal of an aspect of our society: poverty, homeless people, this underbelly of this glamorous city, New York City, trying to really turn things a little upside down and get people to look at that kind of thing and that kind of what was happening clearly, everywhere, in a different way. So, it's kind of extraordinary and interesting, but that I guess maybe that's why they're best pictures, because they're movies you actually think about the next day. They're not just, instant gratification and then entertainment and then we move on. So certainly Midnight Cowboy for me was very influential. Again, often I find that the power of a film sometimes has to do with where you are, how old you are when you first see it, because then that's where sometimes, the memory of the film gets deeply ingrained and whatever kind of emotional response you have. So I didn't actually see it in 1969. I was 15 years old. I did live in New York, though, and not in the city. I lived out on Long Island, but I spent quite a time in New York City, and both my parents were from New York City. And but I did probably see it within a year or two after that. And in those days, movies didn't just show up in the movie theater for, a month or 5 weeks and then go to video or TV, So, a big movie like this would still be in movie theaters for 2 years, after, there was, it was a whole different model for the distribution of films. So I did see it in a movie theater, and I certainly remember the impact of it. And then, of course, when I was in university and later on, but it was really interesting to watch it again this week in a completely different context. Now, as you know, this was based on a novel by James Leo Herlihy, I think is how you say his name. And the film was not just a critical success, it was a huge box office success as well. It was made for only $3.2 million, which was, low budget even for that time, but it managed to gross almost $44 million. So, incredibly financially successful, not just critically successful. And then, of course, when the Academy Awards rolled around, it was nominated for 2, 4, 6, 7 Academy Awards, and it won for Best Picture. The producer Jerome Hellman. It won for Best Director, John Schlesinger. Both Hoffman and Voight were both nominated, but did not win. The winner, you probably know, but I was going to have you guess, but it was John Wayne for True Grit, which is very amusing considering the aside about John Wayne in the movie. Sylvia Miles, Cassie got nominated for Best Supporting Actress. She's in the film for 5 minutes. Best Adapted Screenplay, and it won for Waldo Salt, his first screenplay after being blacklisted for almost 15 years, and was nominated for Best Film Editing as well. So, when I look at the movie now, it really stays in your memory, this film, and much longer than perhaps grander films or more sophisticated films. And I thought, I was thinking a lot about why. And at the end of the day, for me, it's a love story. And I think I mentioned that last. It's a love story between this naive Joe Buck and, our street savvy Ratso Rizzo, and in quite an extraordinary way, because there weren't romance films at that time. Of course, homosexuality was a very complicated subject, barely talked about. In fact, in England, it was still, well, and that's not true. In 1967 was, when homosexuality was actually legalized. Up until then, it was an offense. And even then, it was only, 2 consenting adults over the age of 21, private. But it was about a subject, and then, as I said, most importantly, it really was this subject about who are these poor people, homeless people we see begging on the streets, and we ignore, and we don't know much about them, and we never want to pay attention to them. And here's a film that really took us deep inside this kind of, underbelly or other dark part of society that we never see. The fact that the film got made at all is just kind of incredible, but it came at a very particular time in Hollywood studios film, history. So what had happened is that by 1969, the classic Hollywood studios were sort of gone, everybody under contract, and the way we've talked about in the past. And also the code, the production code had also ended. And the production code had been replaced by a rating system. This is the first time, I think it was 67, maybe around then, that we started to get, at least in the States, it was P and PG, and then R, 17 above, and X. I think later on they added PG-13. I'm not sure that was there at the very beginning. And the idea was that rather than there being a very complicated system, which the production code was, this would sort of simplify things. It would standardize things. And both for the studios and the audience would be very clear. Now, controversy continues to this day, obviously. And there are all sorts of battles that go on between filmmakers and the rating boards because you didn't used to want to get an R rating because that would limit your audience. And of course, nobody ever wants an X rating because that basically means, you're a porno film or something. But it did ultimately start to make things work a little smoother than it did in its day. And there is a little story I'll tell you about why this wound up with an X rating and how that all happened. But again, this was also a time when you were moving into a period of sort of the independent filmmaker. There was a new bunch of guys running the studios. We talked about Robert Evans at Paramount, Daryl Zanuck at 20th Century. And of course, at United Artists, there was a guy named David Picker. United Artists, who were the producers and distributors of this film, as you may remember, was always sort of the talent studio. In fact, it was created by talent, by D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and Charlie Chaplin. And they formed this studio way back in I don't remember the exact year, but probably the early 30s. And the purpose to, work a little bit outside of the control of the money guys. And through the decades, United Artists always made very exceptional films and always attracted sort of independent talent and foreign talent and took chances. And that was certainly true of this film. And in fact, it's hard to sometimes know if it's United Artists films because they always released their films through MGM. They didn't have their own complete distribution system. So unlike, Paramount Film or sometimes it's confusing because it may come out through an MGM film. But basically what this meant though was that these new heads were taking risks and the risks were paying off. Movies like, Five Easy Pieces or Bonnie and Clyde. And, there was a slew of films being made around this period of time that actually were making money and finding new audiences and also finding critical success. So this was not, a complete anomaly that Midnight Cowboy happened. And certainly John Schlesinger, the director, was seen as one of those kinds of filmmakers. He had made a movie already in the UK called Darlin, with starring Julie Christie. This is the movie that launched Julie Christie's career. And that was also a movie that really took a very kind of interesting, took you on an interesting dive through mod culture of London, of the swinging, 60s in London. But also, it was a story of a call girl, though. It was a story with, a lot of flash and clothes and music and everything else, but was really an interesting kind of cultural film as well in terms of capturing a particular time and place. And certainly that's what Schlesinger did as well with this film. Again, watching it this time, what really struck me was this kind of, visceral portrayal of what does it mean to be homeless? What does it mean to be poor? What does it mean to be destitute? What is that experience actually like? And although it wasn't part of the plot, really, it's not a plot about poverty or homelessness. The empathy that the filmmaker was able to create and the actors for those characters was something that was sort of badly needed. It really helped people start to perhaps, again, this is just my perception, but really made people perhaps start to think again about when they were walking down the street and there was, the bums sleeping on the side or the panhandlers. And I grew up, as I said, in New York or near New York, and New York City in 1969, even the early 70s was kind of a horrible place. I mean, it was really dangerous, and you remember all the wealthy people had all left the city; they had all moved out to the suburbs. It was the drugs were on the rise. Racial problems were happening. I can remember we'd go to concerts at Fillmore East and come out at midnight. We'd hide our money in our shoes before we got on the subway. I'm not sure how that would have helped us if someone wanted to rob us, but it was tension filled. And of course, they filmed this, live on the streets. Those aren't extras. They would go out and shoot every night till 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And they would literally hide the cameras in like a milk truck or something. So no one actually could see the cameras, but they would have, the actors walking around and dealing with people, and no one knew that things were being filmed, and I think the film, you kind of feel that at times. You can, you sense this kind of very natural, almost documentary style that the film has been made in, and it's kind of extraordinary, and I think adds for so much of the authenticity of the movie. And it was dangerous. I mean, the crew was told, they weren't allowed to go more than like 2 blocks in any direction from where they were filming, because it was, and they literally did, find, a dead body lying on the street, in an alley, that they were about to shoot in, and this wasn't something they had to dress up and do a lot of set dressing for. It was what it was, and again, for me, and we'll talk a little bit about their actors and their performances, but I can't remember a film where I've ever felt like I was more transported into another character and being able to empathize and relate to their emotions and their feelings, who was, obviously extraordinarily different than this, privileged 19-year-old kid growing up on Long Island. This film did it for me, and it did it for me again watching it this time. So, now the rating thing, just briefly to get through it, is the idea of the X rating actually was not the first rate. It actually had an R rating. And the head of United Artists at the time was a guy named Arthur Krim, very famous guy, brilliant guy, hugely important figure in the entertainment industry and in American society. He was a great liberal, supporter of Kennedy and Johnson, very enlightened and very liberal guy. But he was concerned about the film and the subject matter, and he allowed himself to be influenced by a guy named Aaron Stern, a psychiatrist, that this movie was really had a homosexual frame of reference and could be a danger to America's youth. And he actually convinced Arthur Krim, so United Artists himself kind of supported getting an X rating. They actually were worried that this film might have, undue inappropriate influence. Now, of course, oddly enough, and I'm not sure if he knew this or not, by giving it an X rating, it became very controversial. So, of course, commercially, it may have actually helped the film, because everybody was dying to see what was this X-rated movie. And when you really think about it, the movie doesn't have that much sex or nudity, or, well, it has obviously some pretty intense violence. But within a year, it became R-rated without a piece of footage being changed. So this whole only movie to ever get an X-rated Academy Award. There were 2 others that were actually nominated. There was Last Tango in Paris, and I can't remember the other one. Do you remember, Jeff, there was one other X-rated movie that actually nominated but never won an Academy Award. So I thought that was interesting. And, again, there's so much, and I'm really curious to hear what you guys thought about this subject, and particularly this whole issue of homosexuality, and whether this is sort of a, both, the way, the expression faggot, the campiness of the cowboy duds, the Ratso's fantasy of Joe running shirtless in the beach, Joe, incapable, of having sex with Brenda Vaccaro after, the part. So this was all very, very, complicated stuff. And of course, I don't know what to say. Sometimes I find it gets in the way. And I think that's what the filmmakers felt as well. The book itself was written by a gay man, and the homosexuality was much more overt than in the movie itself. So they clearly did decide to not make the film about that subject. But, and in fact, sometimes I feel like all those distractions that are going on with all the different, the big party scene and all the flashbacks and, and dream sequences almost are kind of getting in the way of, this little perfect diamond of a masterpiece of these 2 characters. It's like almost, Waiting for Godot or something like that. So again, the best thing for me was clearly the performances of Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman. And this, established Voight's career. He barely had a career before this. People didn't know him. And he was 30 years old. He had been around for a while. And Hoffman, of course, had already done The Graduate. And no one had known him before that. But The Graduate, done in 1967, really put him on the map. And but of course, he's was not ever going to be a traditional movie star. So roles like this, of course, were very important for him. And the other irony is that Jon Voight is from New York. He's from Yonkers, and of course Dustin Hoffman is from LA. So he had to play the New Yorker, and Jon Voight had to play this kid from Texas and hide his New York accent. And it wasn't easy for Voight. In fact, at one point he almost got fired. He was having so much trouble with his accent, but eventually it all came together. The real key, of course, though, was John Schlesinger, a fantastic British director. As I mentioned, he really started to get attention in 1965 when he did Darling. And, and this film was something that he had read the book. He was quite taken by the book. James Hurley, who wrote the book, as I said, was a fairly, within certain circles, known gay man. He was a very close friend of Tennessee Williams, and used to spend time in Key West. He was part of a certain culture and a certain style at the time. And the book, wasn't a huge success, but it was known certainly in the community. Very tragically, Hurley never really achieved much other success after this, and wound up, suicide at the age of 66. But when Schlesinger read the book, I think he saw an opportunity, as he said in his own words, to, I'm going to make a film in America, and this is the only one that I want to do. And fortunately, his first film had gotten enough attention that David Picker of United Artists basically said, you find something you want to do, bring it to us, we'll do it. And even though his UK producer, Schlesinger, wouldn't do the movie, he thought it was too controversial, he found, Jerry Hellman to be the producer. They brought the book to David, and the budget was low enough, and they were going to give this filmmaker Schlesinger a shot. Now the producer, Jerome Hellman, had an interesting career. He wasn't he actually was a director as well, but besides making this happen and being the producer, he also did several films with Schlesinger. In fact, they did a film called Day of the Locust, based on the Nathaniel West book. That's a brilliant film about Hollywood, actually the early days of Hollywood. And then, of course, Hellman also was the producer of Coming Home. And that was the great Hal Ashby directed that film. And of course, the film that Jon Voight won an Academy Award for Best Actor, and Coming Home actually was nominated for Best Picture. I don't think it won Best Picture. But from Jerome Hellman's point of view, he got right away. Everyone got that the relationships between the two guys was something that was going to work. His concern, again, was homosexuality. It would become a catastrophe. And when he went to meet John Schlesinger, Schlesinger was still parading as a straight man. And except he had, this guy lived in his attic. He was never, Hellman could never meet. And, so eventually they decided, let's work together. And it was, in fact, just as he began to make this film that John Schlesinger did come out. And in fact, he was one of the very first visible gay men working in Hollywood. And in fact, he met someone on the film who became his boyfriend and lover. And it was kind of, added a whole nother level to what was going on in the film itself and the experience of the film, that this man was really taking this very brave, step of revealing and being open to the media and everyone about his own homosexuality. So although the film has a very loose quality, the script was worked on for months and is very carefully crafted. And they tried one or two writers. They wanted Gore Vidal to write it, but he wanted them to do one of his books. But they finally came upon Waldo Salt. And Waldo Salt was a very brilliant Hollywood writer who was blacklisted. He was part of that horrible period of time with McCarthy and the communist fervor. And so from 1952 to like 1966, Waldo Salt could not work in Hollywood, like Dalton Trumbo and others. And, he did, write a few scripts that may have been made, under other names, but it really wasn't until Midnight Cowboy, when he was hired by these guys, by Schlesinger and Hellman, that he really had a shot to get going again in his career. And obviously was a master writer and a master craftsman. And some of the movies he wrote after this included The Day of the Locust and Coming Home, but he also wrote Serpico, another great film, The Gang That Couldn't, so this really, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight was his other film in 1971. So clearly an extremely talented writer at work. And what was also so extraordinary was that they really did do as faithful an adaptation as they could for some of the story, and they retained a lot of the dialogue from the book. But and again, they really tried to make this, sort of relationship-based social commentary on, now what we call marginalized communities, right? None of it happened fast. It took about 3 months to get the pages, and the biggest problem was in the book, a lot of it takes place in Texas, right, before he gets to New York. And their intuition, of course, was you had to get him to New York as soon as possible. So that's why a lot of what happens in the, in terms of the past is done in these flashbacks or dream sequences or all these kind of crazy, representations of what happened and, what it was like for Joe growing up and his different experiences. And, I think they work, looking at them now, at the time they were quite sensationalistic and kind of new, when I look at them now, they all seem a bit overwrought. I mean, in fact, sometimes even confusing as to what this whole backstory is. And, you get the sense he had this strange relationship with his grandmother. And of course, there's Crazy Annie, who, he has sex with, but she has been having sex with other guys. And, and of course, Crazy Annie is played by Jennifer Salt, who's Waldo Salt's daughter. If you remember that character, of course, and she actually went on to become a very successful writer herself and a showrunner, and works in Hollywood. But it must be a little strange for her father to be watching this film and her daughter playing this quite crazy girl. But most importantly, it was the collaboration, as usual, that worked so well. In fact, the photographer, Adam Hollander, said, Waldo Salt and John Schlesinger had such an incredible partnership, not just during the writing of the script and preparation, but throughout the entire production. And, Hollander's made 40, 50 movies. He said, I've never seen a better creative process than, what happened with these two, the writer and the director, and how they bounced ideas off each other, and, how the film continued to improve over time. Another moment on Schlesinger. So Schlesinger, as I said, grew up in the UK, very wealthy, Jewish family, very, sophisticated guy. He was, of course, in World War II. He started doing some films, went to Oxford. He was, the president of the Oxford University Dramatic Society. But, these are the 60s, and he was certainly a very gay and liberal guy. So Darlin, as I mentioned, I think that was 64, 65. He also made a film called Far From the Madding Crowd, a big flop, and then Midnight Cowboy. And after that, he had a troubled relationship with Hollywood. He made a couple of good films. I mentioned The Day of the Locust and also Sunday Bloody Sunday. And then one of his great classic thrillers is called Marathon Man, which was also with Dustin Hoffman. And if you've ever seen that film, it is a thriller, but he was always known for sort of these meticulously observed, very realistic relationships and sort of complex studies of human, interaction, right? So, what can I say? This was the milieu, this was the setting of all of this, how it came to be. Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight. Now, Dustin Hoffman, as you notice, got top billing because he was known a little better. But of course, this is really Jon Voight's movie. And in fact, I remembered it, and everybody remembers it so well for Hoffman's performances as Ratso Rizzo. But I found myself watching the film this week and really appreciating Jon Voight's performance on a completely different level than I had in the past. And because a lot of what Jon Voight does as an actor is not big. It's not obvious. It's not, there aren't a lot of flourishes. I mean, Ratso Rizzo, Hoffman, that was like, incredible performance. But Voight's, it's much more controlled. You see his performance in his eyes. A lot of time you'll notice the camera's on him and he's just looking and looking. But, as they often say, the eyes are the window to the soul, and certainly true in film. And I found myself really drawn in, and it's almost like that type of performance, you as an audience has to work a little harder. You have to pay attention a little more because it's not all being handed to you, and it's certainly not being told to you in dialogue, or, he never sort of explains how he feels about anything. So I just found it just fascinating to watch him this time. Now, when they started to cast, of course, the role was considered, wow, really going to be a punk. Believe it or not, there were conversations about Elvis playing the role. He wanted to do a serious film. Warren Beatty was considered, but he was too old already in 1969. And Michael Saracen actually was cast in the role for a moment or two, but they had a problem with him because, and he screen tested, everybody screen tested in those days, because he just wanted too much money. He was a little better established star, and Jon Voight agreed to do it for scale. I wouldn't want to think that's the only reason, but that certainly helped. And Saracen, in fact, did another great movie that year called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? That Sidney Pollack directed with Jane Fonda. So you may remember him as an actor, and he was a good actor at the time. But they were trying, they still were looking at the screen tests, and everyone could see that Dustin Hoffman was clearly the better actor. And they asked Hoffman himself, because Hoffman was cast first and he tested with Jon Voight and Michael Saracen. And Hoffman's comment was, when I look at my scenes with Michael Saracen, I look at myself. When I look at my scenes with Jon Voight, I look at Jon. And everyone kind of realized that had to be the way it was going to go, and that is the way it go. And thank goodness. The only one who was not so sure was actually the director, John Schlesinger, because he had seen The Graduate, of course. But he went to see a play that Hoffman was in that was quite different, and then he went to meet Hoffman, and I think he was meeting him outside some restaurant, around Times Square, whatever. And he's waiting for, and he sees this guy come up to him with, like a dirty raincoat, and, filthy hair. It was Dustin Hoffman. He kind of decided he was going to be the part for his meet. It wasn't an audition, but the first time he met the director, he was going to come in character. And as soon as Schlesinger saw him, he said, "Okay, that's it. I'm going to do this." And Voight, I think, was the one who really brought sort of this great belief in this film. And in fact, at one point, Schlesinger was very nervous about how this was all going. And it was sort of towards the end when they were filming in Texas, and had real anxiety about it, because this was really controversial stuff, as you know. And the story is that Voight went up to him and said, "Jon, we will live the rest of our artistic lives in the shadow of this great masterpiece." And Jon says, "You think so?" And Jon was like, "I'm absolutely sure of it." And, he was really just trying to, give the director a little boost, but it turned out to be absolutely true. The only person, though, who was even considered for the Ratso's part, before, while they were basically set on Hoffman, was Robert Blake. I don't know if you remember him. He was a great child actor. He was also in the great movie In Cold Blood, and of course, a big TV star, Beretta, all sorts of things. But I think it was pretty clear from the beginning this was going to be Hoffman. De Niro always described Dustin Hoffman as an actor with an everyman's face who embodied the heartbreakingly human. I thought that was a great line. And Hoffman grew up in LA, always wanted to be an actor. He went to Pasadena Playhouse to be trained. That's where a lot of the LA actors work. In fact, that's where he met Gene Hackman, who became a lifelong friend. He and Hackman went off to New York together, and their other best buddy was Robert Duvall. The three of them lived in some shitty apartment somewhere, and were all trying to get going, at the same time. And then with The Graduate, that was just kind of a fluke thing. And Mike Nichols took a huge chance on this guy, not classically handsome or anything else, but saw something. And with that movie, it's almost like Dustin Hoffman suddenly became handsome. I mean, kind of like Humphrey Bogart wasn't really handsome, but they really had something as characters that I think was that's always worked for them. And when you think about some of the movies, of course, now that Hoffman made later, and Rain Man or Tootsie. I mean, what an extraordinary career for an actor who really didn't look like there was much, opportunity or much, what was he going to, what was going to happen. And in fact, after The Graduate, Hoffman was very worried about being thought of as a movie star, and so he was very worried about that, and he was very attracted to this role of Ratso Rizzo to really show what he could do as an actor and do something very special and different, and of course he did. But his agent was so worried, he made him do another movie later that year with Mia Farrow called John and Mary. I don't know if anyone remembers that film, but he plays sort of a handsome leading man, and it's kind of a terrible movie. But anyhow, and what a performance. So Hoffman, as you know, is a method actor, that very much of that tradition and that kind of training. And he just, would get into a character on such a deep level and kind of stay there, for a very long time. And of course, not only, with the accent, but he had some dental appliances, you notice that not only changed the shape of his face, but also, affected a little bit of his vocal quality. He would wear pebbles in his shoes, as he would say, if I was doing theater and I was doing a part every night, I wouldn't need pebbles in my shoe, because I would be so deeply in this character and doing it. I would just, have the muscle memory to remember to walk that way. But when you're doing a movie and you're shooting it so fast and out of sequence and everything else, it's hard to remember. So he would put pebbles in his shoes. And he's not the only actor who's ever done this, And if you remember his walk, it's quite distinctive in this film. Not completely just acting, but this is the kind of commitment that these kinds of so he would limp. He didn't have to think about it. He would also get some of those scenes where he's getting sick at the end and his coughing fits. He would get himself so worked up doing these coughing fits. One time he actually wound up vomiting right onto John's onto John, and that. But that's what they were. They were. It was kind of described. They were like two prize fighters. They both were just at the top of their game and sort of slugging it out, and who could top who, and there was and again, when I think of, to me, the best scenes in these movies are the scenes that take place in their little apartment, and that was actually a set. It was copied off of a homeless in a derelict building that the production designer found, but it was a set. But those scenes with the two of them in the apartment, I'm not sure how many there are, 5 or 6 of them in the apartment itself, with the posters of Florida and everything else, were quite extraordinary. And I really think, at least for me, that was really the heart of the film, and what I think is, what still worked for me this time. Let's see, what else could I tell you? Well, then, of course, there were the other actors. Character actors were all wonderful. There was Sylvia Miles, again, 45 years old, but she was a real fixture in the New York scene. She got an Academy Award nomination for her 6 minutes in the movie, and was friends with all those kind of people. And in fact, when someone saw this movie, Maureen Stapleton saw the movie, she said, God, that's amazing. They went out and found a hooker and put her in the movie. And Julia said, that's not a hooker, that's Sylvia Miles. Brenda Vaccaro, of course, great actress, very much out of that same method world. She went on to success. Young Bob Balaban, 24 years old. He plays the young kid who picks up Joe at the movie theater and then has no money. He went on to become a great actor, Close Encounters and Altered States, and a very good director and producer as well. The photographer, this was his first movie he had ever shot. His name was Adam Hollander. He was Polish, and he was recommended by Roman Polanski, who was Schlesinger's friend. And they really wanted to. He wanted someone. This was the kind of guy Schlesinger was, and Hollander did a great job and went on to a pretty successful career. One of his other known films he did about a year later was Panic in Needle Park with Al Pacino. Now, of course, when they were shooting, as I said, one of the most extraordinary things was that they just would shoot with no extras and just a normal crowd of pedestrians crossing the street. And so, they had to build this large box where the camera and the camera operator could go, and everything just sort of flowed. And after a while, it wouldn't work because, the director would run out of the box and talk to the actors and run back. People would start to notice. But I think they got some very interesting shots that way. And of course, one of the most famous moments of the movie is the moment where they step out in front of the taxi cab and Ratso says his famous line, we're walking here. And there's a lot of controversy about whether that was ad-libbed or not ad-libbed or in the script, and was it a random taxi cab or was it some stunt driver in a taxi cab? But I like to believe it was improvised. One of the reasons I think it was improvised, if you watch Jon Voight at the moment, he looks very startled. He's not acting at that moment. He doesn't know what's going on. And certainly, Hoffman's delivery is so just, immediate and in the flow of his character. But that's, perhaps one of the most famous lines in cinema history. And in fact, as a New Yorker, a line you would use and hear a lot, repeated as one dodges the taxi cabs in New York City. I'm walking here. Very, very funny moment. Music, of course, was extraordinary. Now, remember, they had done The Graduate, and one of the big hits of The Graduate was this incredible song soundtrack that was done by Simon and Garfunkel. So the idea of trying to use a song that would sort of be kind of set the tone and really guide us through the movie had already been set. But there was a song that had been recorded called Everybody's Talking. It was written by Fred Neil, not by Harry Nilsson. And Fred Neil was a great blues artist, very New York kind of guy. And Nilsson had recorded a cover of it, and Schlesinger liked it, so he used it in the temp track. And the idea was, now we'll get a proper song written. And in fact, they had Harry Nilsson write a proper song called I Guess the Lord Must Be in New York City. And but ultimately, they decided the temp track song was better. They also, Bob Dylan wrote a song for this movie. And unfortunately, it wasn't finished in time, but it was Lay Lady Lay. And I don't know if you know that song, but the intention was that song would play during the scene with Brenda Vaccaro when they're having sex and then playing Scrabble. And that would have been interesting. And Randy Newman had been talked to, but the music was all a big part of it. So I think we talked about the reception of it and how powerful it was. Critics were saying things like, I cannot recall a more marvelous pair of acting performances in any one film. That was Gene Siskel. And, Schlesinger's gritty, unrelenting, bleak look at the seedy underbelly of urban American life is undeniably disturbing, but Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight's performance makes it difficult to turn away. And it went on, and again, stayed in the theater for years, got, again, changed to an R rating after a year or two without being changed. So anyhow, why don't we look at some slides and talk a little bit about more of the film? As you can see, I could talk about this all night, but let's see what we got, Jeffrey. Thank you. Okay, so this is the opening, I think it's the actual opening shot of the film. And, I'm not sure exactly, how explicit Schlesinger was trying to be about sort of the emptiness of cinema these days with this big empty screen, in this drive-in, theater. But I think, it served a couple of purposes and obviously established, here we are in Texas, big Tex drive-in, and then this, empty movie screen. Next one. Yeah, so here's one of several early shots. As you remember, Joe Buck is absolutely fascinated by mirrors, and he's, always an image, his image, and, often looking at himself and trying to make sure he's projecting the image of what he thinks a successful hustler is going to look like. I mean, he really has no clue, as we know. I mean, where's he going? What is he going to do? And New York City. And but that's part of the naivete and the innocence of this character. I think that's so beautiful and so charming. Next slide. Yeah, so now he's on the bus and starting to head out. But here's a great moment, as I was saying, if you look at his eyes and you remember that scene and, what's going on in this guy's head, where is he going? And again, we get distracted into these flashbacks and stuff, but I thought, just a great performance. And I think that's a great shot. And, we'll get the superimposition or the reflection of the, of the lines of the road, sitting on top. It's just a very beautiful moment. Next. Yeah, so again, one of these crazy flashbacks and, with his grandma. I don't know, is this is why he became the man, the man he is. I find all that a little bit, but here, but again, it was smart to get him on the bus, get him going to New York. Don't spend a lot of time in Texas. Get the movie going. Next one. Yeah, so this, of course, is, again, one of the most famous shots in cinema history. This idea of the super long lens, picking him out in a crowd. You've seen the shot in so many movies. In fact, it's even parodied. I don't know if you remember the movie Elf. There's this shot with, Will Ferrell as Elf coming through the streets. I mean, many movies have imitated this shot. But again, those are not extras. This is just a hidden camera, and, Jon Voight walking down the street and, letting things just flow. And it's very beautiful shot. Next. Yeah, so here he is with Sylvia Miles. Fun, I mean, again, this isn't a humorous movie for the most part, but at least for this scene, you can have a lot of fun with it. And of course, he thinks he's going to get paid. He winds up giving money to her. I'm not sure this is necessarily a performance that deserved a Best Supporting Actress award, but it just goes to show you how caught up in the whole success of this film the Academy and everybody was, that they would even give her a nomination for this part. Next, please. Yeah, so this is one of their early moments together, and it's the intensity is just incredible, and the chemistry between them, the way they play off each other, very good shot just to kind of capture what those moments were like. Small aside, but if you notice, with Hoffman, the two eyes, this is just a little small film trick, but when you're filming close-ups, it's very important to get both eyes. I learned this early in my film career. Close-ups with one eye are never as successful because you just have that much more information if you have two eyes. So if you watch movies, you'll see that often close-ups are two eyes. They don't like one eye close-ups. Next one. Okay, that's the famous look. We're walking here, and I don't know if you could tell more about, whether it was improvised or not, but also the costumes are just fantastic. The wardrobe and that white suit, and in fact, later on, we see, all the different, wardrobe. I mean, obviously the costume designer had a lot of fun with this. And again, you can see that this was probably shot from, like a milk van, with the lens through the window, because it's all on very long lenses. That's why the background is so compressed and, opposite of deep focus, right? The focus is very specific on these characters and not easy to do, by the way. In fact, if you look, Jon Voight's a little soft, but really kind of, they really pop out, against these soft backgrounds. Next one. Yeah, so this was a crazy scene. I don't know. What's his name again, the actor?
It's John MacGyver.
Oh, John MacGyver, yeah. So this is, Ratso takes him to him and he's gonna, be his pimp, and he turns out to be just a fucking crazy nut. But, I think it was, just another kind of giving us a little glimpse of the, of the fabric of, New York underbelly society, and, and all the crazies. And because that's where all the crazies went. They went to New York City, I mean, it wasn't like you could go and find a scene like this in every city in 1969, I mean, so people came to New York or were from New York, and it was a very mixed up and sad time. But this is anyhow, to me, I don't know, not my favorite scene, but keep going. Yeah, so this is down in the subway. In fact, I was surprised there wasn't even, is this a bus or is this the subway, Jeff? I forget.
That entire flash present
Yeah.
montage in the subway.
Is in the subway, yeah. So subways, of course, were such a huge part of New York City, and very important part of the city, and both, as I said, late at night, scary and dangerous, but very functional. And again, I think these are wonderful shots because they really place our actors in the midst of just the world around them, and I don't believe these were extras. I believe they probably told them, get on the car, stand by the window, and and there was a 3-man crew, and let's just grab a shot of you, because no one seems to be paying any attention to him, and he's just standing there. So, it's a style of filmmaking that still goes on, but at the time it was considered quite revolutionary and very different. Next slide, please.
Fred, if I may just quickly interject, it really has this French New Wave vibe to it.
Yeah, very much so. He was affected by the neo-realistics, the Italians as well, and amazing to see in a Hollywood studio movie, right? So there's Jennifer Salt, Crazy Annie. Again, the flashbacks, and you're the one, you're the only one, and I remember when I first saw the movie thinking, oh, this is really, wow. And, thinking this is so interesting and flashy and black and white and cutty. And I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what you think. But for me, it was all a bit of a distraction this time from really what I cared about. And I'm not sure I really learned that much more about Joe Buck's character from these sequences. Next one. Yeah, more of the same. The kids, with their flashlights, and I don't really want to spend too much time on this. Next one. So now, he gets to New York. This is very funny, of course. This was a very well-known sign, Mutual of New York, and spelling money. But there are a number of shots, of course, of Times Square and other parts of New York that I think captured some of the more iconic images and the iconic, cultural landmarks of the time. Next. Yeah, so here he is, of course, walking along Times Square, and this is just being shot very documentary style, and he's just, people just walking by him. And next one. Yeah, there's Bob Balaban. Very, very interesting shot. Look at that. I love that shot. And of course, again, this whole idea of this, this homosexual undercurrent theme. was very real, obviously. In fact, I bet most of the hustlers, in New York were mostly hustling men, there were lots of ways that men could find women and, call girl prostitute. It was hard to find other men to have sex with. And I'm sure if Joe Bucket knew anything, he realized that's where he could make his money. But of course, ultimately what appears to be is that these experiences with other men trigger something in Joe, and of course, the culminates in that incredible scene with Tolley. Next. But again, the scene in the bathroom where he does, beat this kid up that was a very violent scene. I mean, it's a violent scene for now. For the time, it was a very violent scene, and intentionally so. This was meant to be disturbing. This was, to shake people out of their boots and to really make them feel something, either distaste or anger or appreciation but something. So here he is bopping down, near 42nd Street. Of course, if you go to New York now, Manhattan, 42nd Street is Disneyland, right? And all the big shows are there and everything's, clean and perfect and wonderful and jammed with people, but not in 1969. And, mostly, the twisted sex and, those were the kind of films that showed in Times Square. In fact, I made a film with Roger Corman, showed in Times Square for a long time. Actually, Thomas Crown Affair is back there, so it wasn't all tawdry, but a good shot of New York City. Yeah. Next. Yeah, and then of course this is that great set, of their apartment, and so many powerful scenes there, and they did some interesting thing with camera angles and shooting from up above to kind of give this little more dramatic moment, and I think it was just beautifully done set and very believable, and gave these two actors a chance to do some great stuff. I'm not sure there was much improvisation. I think they really did stick to the dialogue, but I'm sure they did numerous takes and different types of delivery to get the performances they did. Next, please. Yeah, he just has so much raw charisma, I guess is the only word. He's one of these actors you just can't take your eyes off of, because you just don't know what he's going to do next. He's never boring. He's always doing something interesting. Next. Yeah, I love this fantasy sequence of them going to Miami, and of course, this is the most famous part, the running on the beach. If you remember, John's ahead, and all of a sudden Ratso's churning his legs as fast as he can, and he's running out in front. And, again, people sort of made a big deal about, Voight and his sexuality, and, a lot of moments of him with his clothes on or shirtless, and okay, so this is Ratso's fantasy. So, why in Ratso's fantasy does Joe not have his shirt on, and what is the attraction? What is the relationship between the two of them? It's never really spelled out in any direct way. And maybe that's more interesting, that it's sort of up to the viewer if you want to think about these things and come to your own conclusions. But that was a very, very funny sequence. I love that. Next. Yeah, now they're back in the apartment, of course, and Ratso's getting, starting to get sick, and just the, again, the affection, the caring. It's so unexpected, and you keep thinking this isn't real or something. There's going to be a twist or something to all this, but it's very, very real, and much realer than a lot of love stories that I've seen in movies in my day. Next. Yeah, so this is, again, one of the most powerful moments, I think, in the whole movie. They're about to go to the party. Of course, only Joe was invited, but Ratso wants to come, and, they go through all this, and Joe is just such a humane guy. So of course you can come, and now Ratso's having second, and John's trying to wipe him up or comb his hair, or tell him it's going to be okay, and very, very tender moment. Look at him hugging him, and just amazing stuff. Next. Yeah, so here's Brenda Vaccaro at the party. Now, the party was obviously, you know, kind of a spoof on an Andy Warhol happening. I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with Warhol and what was going on in his lofts, and they were making movies and they were doing drugs and there were bands playing. Velvet Underground got started there, though that's not the band playing in this party. But this party to me just sort of dragged on. And I think Schlesinger realized as well that, you know, later on, because this wasn't actually new or that interesting in 1969. Warhol was supposed to be in the part, but he had actually been shot like a month or two before. I mean, he recovered, but he was shot by somebody. But a lot of the people, you know, from his scene were there, and maybe there was fun in picking out the cameos of different individuals. There were a lot of drugs and a lot of smoking. In fact, one of the stories is that the union got very upset because there was so much, you know, marijuana being smoked that the crews were getting high from just inhaling, you know, being in the room with all the smoke. And I don't know, it must have been, you know, crazy 2 nights when they shot this scene, but I'm not sure how much it helped us or told us about either of these characters. Next, please. Yeah, so here he is again, naked, and Brenda Vaccaro. And Brenda Vaccaro was very concerned about being naked, you know, in these sex scenes and everything else. So Schlesinger said, well, why don't you just throw your coat back on? So I actually think it was much sexier having her in that fur coat than if she had actually been naked and they had to, you know, work around different angles and stuff like that. But again, this was one of the few kind of moments of levity and fun. Now, again, you know, people say, oh, well, he wasn't able to, you know, have sex with her. And, well, maybe that means he was really homosexual and that's why he couldn't, you know, get it up or something. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think. And yeah, it wound up being a nice, fun scene. And the next shot, of course, they're playing Scrabble, and he spells money because that's how he thinks money is spelled, because he's seen the billboard so many times. So that's kind of a fun callback to you know, to another moment that you know the old Hollywood masters would do stuff like that. Next. Yeah, and now it's sort of, there's an irony here because it looks like he's actually kind of going to make it as a hustler. You know, Brenda's obviously had a good time. She's calling a friend to recommend him. You know, maybe things are starting to come together. I don't know, but you know, and again, more mirror shots, and I guess he's putting perfume in his boot because it smells so bad. You know, what a naive guy. You know, but look how intense he is about it too. Next, please. Yeah, so here's Thule, a great character actor, Bernard Hughes. Very disturbing scene. Obviously, you know, a masochist, you know, looking to, you know, he wants this guy, he wants to be beat up, and, you know, just as distasteful as it comes. And then, of course, it really goes to a whole nother level with the, you know, when Joe tries, you know, shoves the phone in his mouth, you know, at the end, and it just seems like his reaction is so inappropriate. You know, he got the money. You know, why does he have to do that to this guy? And again, the theory seems to be that, you know, that Thule has touched this kind of, you know, homosexual, you know, feeling in Joe, and Joe finds it so distasteful and it's a self-hatred for himself that he feels that anything at all, and the only way he can express it is through violence, you know, to this guy. I mean, this is, you know, sort of psychology 101, and I don't want to really be quoted on it, but I'm not sure. So we'd love to hear what you guys think. Next. Yeah, so now, you know, again, you know, Ratso, to me, you know, it's like he's an angel. I'm sure, you know, I've been trying to think of the metaphors in literature of this kind of story, you know, where you have the naive innocent who sort of descends into hell and you know, meets an angel who guides him through and in fact gets him out, you know, because at the end of the day, you know, if it hadn't been for Ratso, who knows what this poor guy, I mean, Joe Buck would probably be dead by now. but he does manage to get him out of there. You almost want to believe that, that at the end, when they get to Florida, he won't be a hustler, that he'll get a job. That's the way he talks. Probably not true, but there is something very kind of very classical, I think, in terms of this relationship and the arc that it took. And it's not, Dante and Virgil. But I couldn't find it. If anyone can think of a reference, I'd be curious, because it really is, it felt very classical to me, the arc of the relationship. And then the next one, oh yeah, now, so sad, he dies. Poor Buck goes to the bus driver, there's nothing they could do. He has to sit with a dead body. Next one, please. And he has to sit with this dead body, till they get there. And this, of course, is, again, one of very, very famous shots, not just, the relationship in the two shot and of course, the reflections of Miami and the buildings going by. But once again, watching Jon Voight's performance, watching his eyes, watching this gamut of emotions go pouring through this poor guy, and you really feel something, at least I do, that it's very deep and very meaningful, and I thought, just a wonderful end. One small ironic note is, so as this film appropriately ended on the bus, Dustin Hoffman's last movie also ended on a bus, because if you remember The Graduate, the last scene is him and Catherine Ross sitting at the back of the bus, and she's in her wedding dress, and they don't say anything. And, at first one's smiling and the other's sad, and the other starts smiling, and the other one's sad. But it is sort of amusing that, those two movies that he did back to back, that he both got nominations for, ended on a bus. So there we go. So anyhow, please, I'm sorry I went on so long. Love to hear some questions and comments and thoughts. And what was this like for you guys? Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Great talk. I was thinking about this movie, which I've seen several times, but it's been a long time since I've seen this. And I know, of course, how it ends, and it's a heartbreaking ending, but I just relaxed and sat back and enjoyed the humor between the two characters as well. I think that started to really bring their relationship together as well. You see Hoffman becomes almost a mother figure at times, and is taking good care of him when he's making him his meal, and you're chopping that pepper with a razor blade. It's such a peculiar, but really, I was much more fond of Ratso Rizzo than I had been in previous viewings.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We've got some questions for you this evening. Jeff Duncanson asks, how do you interpret Joe's flashback sequences? Jeff feels that they're a hybrid of straight flashbacks with some fantasy mixed in. How do you see it?
I don't know. I think that's a great question. As I said, the flashbacks to me were a little troubling this time. I'm not sure they're meant to be realistic per se. And again, some are dream sequences, I think, and it's sort of confusing between the two. And I always think about, just in terms of, well, what's the information that, the actors, that the director's trying to tell us? What is important that happened here that has affected him? And I don't really know that it's clear to me. He's obviously grew up in this milieu, in this environment. Crazy Annie, was that his girlfriend, or was that just some girl who slept with lots of guys but liked him? I don't know. He doesn't seem to have enormous guilt or remorse about what happened. And then it's even unclear, do they rape him as well? I don't even know, what's going on here. And oh my gosh, is that why he's gay now? I didn't buy it. Personally, I didn't buy it. I felt that this was, I'm sure in the book it was detailed out and played out, as I said, in a much more linear and appropriate way. But here, I think it was, the director felt it was important. He wanted to include these moments. They were sensationalistic, which, works in movies. And again, when I look at them from, just a stylistic point of view, how they're done and edited and shot, I think it's all very interesting. I just didn't find them emotionally. What did you think? You're asking a great question. What was your opinion? I mean, who's the gentleman who asked the question?
Jeff Duncanson. Jeff, if you want to put it.
Yeah, if you want to comment a little further about it, I'm very curious because again, for me, this part was a little problematic of the film.
Yeah, no, and certainly in the rape flashbacks, it is implied definitely this was happening to Joe Buck as well, as guys are holding his legs, and it's a pretty brutal scene. David Striner, our friend David, says, "What I love about New York City is its great tolerance for deviance. That's why the scene with the religious nut is so effective." And
I agree. That is, well, in New York was always that, because that's where the immigrants came, off the boat. Everybody was from somewhere else, except for the Blue Bloods, of course. It was this very wild, wild west kind of place in a way. It wasn't necessarily dominated, certainly like England or other places, by class or anything else. And it was a land of opportunity. Some succeed and some fail. And I think, again, what was so important about this movie was taking a look at the, not as a documentary, not as a, as a feel-good story about some, homeless person who makes good and gets a job and becomes a success. It just is. It is the environment. It is the world. And I think you're right. New Yorkers are kind of accepting of it. I don't know a lot of other cities where there could be a dead guy lying on the sidewalk and people just step over him and keep going, but that happens. I guess maybe it happened more in those days than now, but certainly happened. But I completely agree with you, David. I've traveled a lot, and New York is, again, this is New York in the 70s. I don't really know what New York is like today, but this was certainly a very highly unusual place, and many people were attracted and came to New York for that reason.
Yeah, and David wants to add, for 5 years in the mid-60s, he worked on 43rd and 8th Avenue. He had to walk from Times Square to 8th. Wow. For the first half, I would be propositioned by the female prostitutes. For the second half, by the male prostitutes. Thanks for that insight, David.
You know well, David. Yeah.
Tracy Truman has some thoughts, and so does Jeff Duncanson as well. The on your flashbacks help. Yeah. Tracy felt the flashbacks helped to get to know Joe. He had a tough life. He was making bad decisions his whole life. The religious upbringing scarred him. So
yeah, I guess so. Maybe that's really what it was, and that's fine, and that's all useful, and maybe that's sort of charming or important because he's still so bloody naive, and so whatever happened to him scarred him, but and in an interesting way, because he still brings this naivete and this kind of, and he expects the good out of people, and even more importantly, he can open his heart to Ratso Rizzo. I mean, what is that? That's sort of an exceptional human being. And at first, of course, it's going to be a business relationship, and he needs somebody to hustle for him and show him the ropes. But very soon the relationship goes way past that, and he could easily, again, he had money, he could dump the guy and just go and do whatever he wanted to do, and of course he would never ever do that. So scarred and maimed, and but what a heart.
A lot of comments this evening from one of our anonymous attendees. I think Buck's violence mirrors information to the general public. At that time, I think homosexual panic was a common defense for vicious violence. And Joel Martin writes that this was the first time viewing the film, and it's not what was expected. Some parts were dated, but the relationship between Joe and Rizzo was very moving. Joe was repeatedly shown to be naive and mild-mannered until he needed money to buy the tickets to Florida. There's definitely the undercurrents of same-sex attraction and Joe's uncertainty. However, I also viewed the interactions with Rizzo as showing Rizzo's desperation for human contact or kindness and affection, as he was a social outcast.
Yeah. I also love the moment we didn't show when they go to Rizzo's father's grave.
Right.
I think that's a very touching scene. and again, just so open and honest, and that Rizzo could talk about his father and talk about that, and then of course it's so touching at the end. Oh, you have to call me Rico. And no Ratso in Florida. Everybody, everyone needs to know me as Rico. And here's this guy dying. And, oh, so, there is this wonderful, someone else mentioned the humor of the film, and certainly it's no comedy, but I think that there are some wonderful, humorous, ironic moments that make it entertaining and just sort of really provide a different color and really fill out this film, in such a way that it is a classic.
Ron Lancaster writes, did we mention Toots Thielman, who was a famous harmonica player whose music was in the score? That harmonica is very mournful.
Right. No, thank you for bringing that up as well. Yeah, I thought the score was good. I did. I mean, it's hard to know. Everybody's talk is such a cliche in a way now, but for people who hadn't never heard the song, and maybe this was the first time they were hearing it, or I think it was interwoven pretty well. And then as you point out, the harmonica was used to sort of extend the the kind of tone of the music and make it consistent throughout the film. But now it feels a little heavy-handed, but I think maybe that's just because we all know it so well.
And a quick comment too, Fred. Apparently, Walt Salt was open to improvisation on this film, and there are a few scenes in the diner, for instance, that's heavily improvised.
Oh,
and it
okay.
really shows just how interwoven it is into the story.
Yeah. No, again, these any director and writer is going to allow for some improvisation, especially when you have Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, and they're kind of slugging it out with their actor chops. But I just don't know specifics. But I think you're right. I did hear something about that diner scene being somewhat improvised. Yeah.
Mitchell Gitten's got an interesting comment. I was struck by how talented Rico was at his scams, his pickpocketing skill, improvisation in poverty, how he played the xylophone, someone who's physically not emotionally crippled.
That's a great point, Mitch. I don't know where that came from. I've never read the novel. I probably should, because I do love this film, and I'm curious if maybe that's expanded on. But he's a walking contradiction, because he also seems somewhat intelligent too, and savvy and he's just again Ratso Rizzo is really thought of as one of the great characters of cinema history, and again for me that was always true, and the surprise this time was how much I really appreciated Jon Voight's performance, and how much and what a deep performance he was able to provide with very simple kind of dialogue and actions to go along with it for the most part.
Great. And Jeff Duncanson did have a follow-up. He felt that the "You're the only one, Joe" line is a narcissistic fantasy by Joe.
Yeah. Well, there you go. That could very well be. Again, that's why anyhow. So listen, guys, this was great. We really try to keep these to an hour, though we obviously ran a little long tonight, but really appreciate everybody's joining us and input. So we are going to take a break. Next weekend is Easter, and we just thought we would take a week off, but then we're going to start up again on Monday, April 12th. We'll stay to 7 o'clock just because we're all used to it. I worry a little the days are getting longer, but we're going to try something completely different, with spring and things getting lighter, and hopefully people getting vaccination and feeling we're turning the corner. We decided to do a series on screwball comedies, time for some laughs. And for those of you who've listened to me talk in film clubs, and screwball comedy, to me it's like film noir. These are the two great genres of Hollywood, and I love them. And of course the practitioners and the writers and producers and actors were so extraordinary, and very much sort of an an American thing like film noir, although, you know, there were screwball comedies made, of course, in other countries. So we're going to start off with a very early one called, and again, if you go to the website, and the information will be there tomorrow or the next day, you know, the westdale.ca, we always give the links of where you can find these films. Some are easier to find than others. We're going to start in 1932 with a film called Trouble in Paradise, directed by Ernst Lubitsch. Lubitsch, of course, was the master who they all trained under, Billy Wilder, etc. An early film, a pre-code film, and you'll see why when you watch it. It's a wonderfully funny film, and really set a lot of the motifs and style of screwball comedy. Remember, this was before It Could Happen One Night. And of course, you know, we could show It Could Happen One Night, but everyone's probably seen that. So we're always trying to do something a little bit different. And then in 1934, they did one of the greatest of all was The 20th Century. And this was directed by Howard Hawks, who later went on to do His Gal Friday and lots of great comedies, among other things. It stars my favorite actress of all time in comedies, Carole Lombard, and John Barrymore, who, of course, you saw in Grand Hotel. And there was a very, very famous train called the 20th Century. And that was, I believe, was from New York to Washington or something like that. And much of it takes place on this train, based on a very successful play. Great, wonderful, funny movie. 1937, The Awful Truth. This is Cary Grant's first great, you know, screwball comedy. Obviously, he went on to do so many, you know, Philadelphia Story and just, you know, endless number of light comedies. This was his first great one with Irene Dunne, and directed by Leo McCarey, a wonderful director who went back to Laurel and Hardy days. The next one will be The Lady Eve, 1941, and this is Preston Sturges. And Jeff is going to be doing the talk about that and talking a lot about Preston Sturges, who was absolutely extraordinary writer, wrote many great comedies before he became a director, went on to be a great director. And this is Barbara Stanwyck, you know, just at her best. And Henry Fonda, who turns out to be quite a, you know, has some real comedic chops of his own. And then we'll wrap it up with a film you probably have seen before and we've talked about before, and that's from 1972 called What's Up, Doc? And this is directed by Peter Bogdanovich and of course stars Barbara Streisand and Ryan O'Neal. And I think it'll be interesting, even if you've seen this film before, to reflect on it, and we can talk about it after seeing, you know, the antecedents of that film, you know, in the four we're going to be watching first, and see what an incredible job Bogdanovich did in drawing upon, you know, the classic elements of the genre and then putting them together for his film. And then, of course, I can't think of, I mean, Barbara Streisand's an anomaly, and she's, you know, certainly hard to compare to other actresses. But I think what she does in this movie is great. And if you've never seen this film, you know, you should, and you will. So there we go. Come to the westdale.ca, get all the information, April 12th. Now, unfortunately, you know, Hamilton has gone to the gray zone, so our private screenings are canceled. We won't be able to do those until we get back in the red zone. So very unfortunate, because lots of people were doing the private screenings. I went to one on Tuesday. It was fantastic. And, you know, and to be able to see movies on the big screen again. And, but, you know, from what I understand, you know, things will be getting better. And hopefully by the beginning of the summer, certainly by the fall, we will be back in the theater again, watching films. And I look forward to seeing you all in person then, instead of this virtual reality that they call it. Anyhow, have a good night. Thank you again, Jeff, for all your help in the slides. Much appreciated.
A pleasure. Have a great week, everybody. Thanks, Fred.
Bye-bye.